welcome on ACCA webinar dedicated to Advanced Audit and Assurance paper. My name is Jana Sekvencová and I teach for PwC's Academy in Prague. Advanced Audit and Assurance is my main subject. The aim of this webinar is to give you some insight into AAA exam, which was set in March 2020, and using this exam as an illustration to give you some useful exam technique tips. So because we are going to talk about this exam, it may be useful for you to download this exam together with answers and examiner's report from ACCA webpage and to refer to it as you are watching this webinar. Let's introduce very quickly the structure of AAA exam. It consists of 3 compulsory questions. Question 1 being for 50 marks, including 4 professional marks. The other 2 questions for 25 marks. And let's start our debrief with question 1. And let me show you at the very beginning how to easily earn 2 professional marks out of these 4 professional marks available. So 1 mark can be earned just by making a heading of briefing notes, and the second one for making introductory paragraph. The key here is to keep it short and just copy the information from requirements in Exhibit 1. It is very typical for AAA exam that the requirements for question 1 are always in a form of email from audit engagement partner to audit manager and typically are located in such a box in the exhibit number 1. So you can see that this email instructs audit manager to perform some planning steps, and these instructions are in fact the requirements itself. I highlighted the requirements for you in colors so that you can see which parts of this exhibit 1 I used for putting together my answer for question 1. Better said, the beginning of the answer. So this is my beginning of my answer. You can see I made a heading of briefing notes. And then I followed by copying what is in the heading of an email in Exhibit 1. I just switched the audit partner for audit manager and the other way around. And that's my first mark. The second mark I got for putting together an introductory paragraph. And again, if you compare the colors with the previous screen, you would see where I got the information which I put here. And you would appreciate that these are really just copied requirements into this paragraph. And that's it. We do not spend much more time here, because it would be waste of this precious time and it would not earn us any further marks. So we have to move on, make a heading for A requirement, and in our case, it would be audit risks. The value of requirement A is 24 marks, which makes it most important requirement from question 1. Traditionally, it represents risk assessment at the planning stage of the audit. Well, this is extremely important task for the auditor, as it identifies the areas of financial statements in which we may see high risk of material misstatement, and it helps the auditors to concentrate audit procedures on these risky areas. In March 2020, we were asked to produce risk assessment for audit risk. Audit risk is the risk that the auditor issues wrong audit opinion on financial statement. It generally consists of risk of material misstatement and detection risk. Risk of material misstatement can relate to any accounting problem described in the scenario or indicated by numbers. Detection risk can be anything which makes it more difficult for the auditor to find errors in the financial statement. On the next screen, I listed some general factors which both in reality and in scenarios may signal higher detection risk. In case of March 2020 RIG Group, it was, for example, the necessity to rely on component auditor and also the issue with group finance director and legal case. So if I should give you some summary of recommended approach to answering the requirement A, it would be this one. Let me stop by the last point. Write only that many risks that are covered by marks. Well, there is always something which is called marking scheme at the end of each answer paper. So now you can see how the marking scheme for question 1A looked like. It gives you information how many marks are available for which activity. So if we make some simple review of this, some simple calculation, and deduct from the total marks 3 marks available for trend calculations and 4 marks available for materiality calculations, we arrive to 17 marks available in total for audit risks. Each audit risk, well explained, is worth 3 marks. So 17 over 3 means that we should bring 5 to 6 audit risks. Our answer should ideally include 5 to 6 well-explained audit risks supported by materiality and trend calculation, each risk presented under separate heading. Let's now move to requirement B. In first part of requirement B, you were asked to evaluate component auditor strategy in Exhibit 4 for 10 marks. So your answer should ideally include 10 well-explained points. Audit strategy, in simple words, is the response of the auditor to issues identified. So the requirement can be rephrased in a way, is the reaction of component auditor following ISA and ethical requirements? And if not, how it should be done differently? What is missing in the response? And there was also one key underlying point to understand, and that was the fact that we are in the group audit. So we have component level audit of components financial statements, and we have the group level audit of group consolidated financial statements. So the evidence which is gathered by component auditor may be enough to conclude on component level, but it may not be sufficient appropriate on the group level. And it was clearly illustrated on the issue with sale of property to group CEO. In that case, it was issue important for group financial statements, and the group auditor needed more evidence to be gathered. Which exactly evidence it should be was the question of the next requirement, in which you should produce 6 well-explained audit procedures on the sale of property to group chief executive officer. How to produce specific piece of audit evidence, or how to form the specific audit procedure. It's quite useful to ask yourself 3 questions. What you are going to examine, from who or from which resource you are going to get it, and why you want it. What is the purpose of this piece of evidence? So if you answer all these 3 questions, you may get nice specific piece of evidence, such as obtain the estimate of fair value of property from review of current market price of similar property to verify the reasonableness of sales price. Last requirement C was sort of rescue requirement, the easiest one, but only in case you knew what the joint audit was. So for 6 marks, you should discuss and illustrate on scenario the advantages and disadvantages of joint audit, which is the audit in which two auditors share responsibility and liability for the audit. So they both sign the audit report. And the advantages and disadvantages all comes down to cost and quality of the audit, quality being typically increased. So you should talk about really practical things and show that you are not only practitioner but also the businessman. So things like travel cost and accommodation cost were appropriate to be brought into your answer here. Requirement A of question 2 gives us three small scenarios. I'd like to discuss two of them. First scenario relates to fraud uncovered by the client. We are asked to discuss the implications of this fraud for the completion of the audit and the actions to be taken by the auditor. First of all, I list the facts which are important from the scenario. And then for each of the facts, I'd assess implications. The most important thing in this scenario is the fact that the client insists the amount of the fraud was immaterial and that all the fictitious invoices were provided to auditor. So, what do we know about fraud? It is that it is typically very well hidden. So there is a risk that the scale of the fraud may be much bigger than the client uncovered. And that's maybe also the worry of finance director, who insists that no further work should be done. So, based on these implications, we have to somehow react. Because of the behavior of a finance director and because of the fact that there is fraud involved, we should apply increased professional skepticism. The main goal of the further investigation would be to determine the real scale of the fraud. And once we conclude about the materiality of the fraud, we have to report our findings to management and those charged with governance. We should also report the behavior of finance director to those charged with governance. Second issue, which I'd like to talk about, relates to development cost, and we are asked to comment on the sufficiency and appropriateness of audit evidence and recommend further actions and evidence to be gathered. I'd recommend the similar approach as in previous case. So first of all, list the important facts from scenario, and for each of the facts, assess whether it forms sufficient and appropriate evidence. What are the main problems connected with development cost? Well, first of all, we have to distinguish between research and development. Potentially, some of the amounts may be research, but we don't know because the auditors only checked amounts of invoices, but not the nature of costs. So we do not know whether some research is involved or not. Second problem, which is connected with development cost, is whether they really meet capitalization criteria of IS 38. And again, the scenario indicates that there was not much audit work done in this area. There was an attempt to verify future cash flows which would be generated by the project. However, detailed review was made impossible by finance director who refused to give access to the spreadsheet. So again, we have to react on these facts and we have to bring in further evidence. Most important thing would be to verify the correct split of cost between research and development, and also to make sure that development costs are capitalized based on recognition criteria of IS 38. Requirement B brings us to the final stage of the audit, in which all three issues from requirement A are completed and covered by sufficient appropriate evidence. The auditor concluded that there was material misstatement in receivables and the client didn't adjust this material adjustment. So the audit opinion will be qualified. We are given extract from proposed audit report and we are asked to critically appraise it for 8 marks. Now, if you look at the extract, it's not really long and we have to earn 8 marks. So you really have to criticize every single word which appears in the extract. What is the approach to similar type of questions, or what we can typically see in similar type of questions? Well, it is typically wrong order of paragraphs, wrong headings of paragraphs. It can be also misuse of emphasis of metaparagraphs or other metaparagraphs. Also, typically, the scenarios use offensive wording, unprofessional wording, or wording which is not in line of requirements of international standards of auditing. Make sure you practice similar types of questions so that you are able to spot these hints and earn sufficient number of marks. Examiner's report for March 2020 sitting states that question 3 was handled quite well by the students. Maybe it is because it contains 3 areas of AAA syllabus which are quite popular and frequently examined. And it is acceptance of the engagement, procedures on cash flow forecast, and ethical scenario. Let's first have a look at requirement A, its first part, which asks us to explain the matters to be considered before accepting the engagement for prospective financial information of Lavenza Company. Uh, Acceptance procedures are very important for both audit and assurance engagements because we do not want to take on the risky clients or risky engagements. Of course, you may learn some generic list or sort of library of acceptance activities, which are similar for both audit and assurance. But of course, during the exam, you have to pick only those activities from the library which are relevant to the scenario and to the type of the engagement. So in our case, we had prospective financial information. So we could go straight to these points here. And if you write them in your answer, you could get quite nice 3 points without really much effort. But then, of course, you have to be more specific to the scenario, and you had to bring in ethical, risk related, and practical issues, such as do we have enough staff, competent staff, to perform this review? Second part of requirement A was dedicated to those actual procedures which you would perform on that cash flow forecast if once you accepted the engagement. Now, 9 marks were available, which means 9 well described, meaning specific procedures. Well, again, I would recommend that you first go for easy marks. And in case of cash flow forecast or any other prospective financial information statement, it would be agreeing the opening balances of the forecast to bookkeeping or audited financial statements and checking arithmetical accuracy of the forecast. Then, of course, the more difficult part comes, and you have to construct procedures which are specific to the scenario and take into account all the information there. And I would again use the method of 3 questions which we introduced in the brief to the question 1. It is always good to start with verifying all the assumptions to supporting documentation and discussion with management. You take it one by one and you write procedures for all the assumptions. Once you have them verified, you have to make sure that the forecast is based on them. To do this, you can of course do some calculations, but maybe under the exam stress, it is easier for you just to describe in words what would you do and how would you recalculate the figures. Last scenario, which was examined in the question number 3, was related to Moritz company, and it was classical ethical and professional issues scenario. Well, precondition for making good answer in this area is good knowledge of code of ethics and ability to spot, classify, and explain ethical threats. It is also good if you know the safeguards which are applicable to the threats and can decrease them to acceptable level. And it is also good if you know how to structure your answer so that it scores uh, most of the marks. Well, for this purpose, the examining team prepared a technical article on exam technique, and you can find it on accaglobal.com. So this is this one, Exam Technique, Part 1, Ethics. I strongly recommend that you go through it as a part of your preparation for the exam. It tells you what you need to know, and it also tells you how to apply the knowledge. That's all from me. I hope this webinar is going to help you with your preparation for your AAA exam. Thank you for attention, and I wish you good luck with your exam.